Hello everyone, welcome back to the Mythic YouTube channel. My name is Kana and today you will be hearing both sides of the recent Blizzard changes for Mythic Plus and the final two bosses of Nia Lofa. We're basically going to be talking about what the changes mean for the two final bosses, as they have increased the loot from those two bosses with a plus 10 item level compared to the other bosses. And we will be talking about the Mythic Plus changes for plus 15 keys. But first, let's start with the boss changes. What does this increasement mean for us? It basically means that there is some more value to clearing the last two bosses than there normally is. A lot of the times, take for example Battle of the Zawalor, we didn't clear Jaina at all for almost the entire tier. Maybe we killed it 10 times after we killed it first, and that was mostly because we had a boost for the mount. Sometimes the bosses just tend to not be worth the amount of effort it actually takes to kill, and you would rather at that point split raid into killing more bosses with more raids. So this increasement, in my opinion, is really good, as long as they manage to balance the gear, obviously. But it makes it really good because it makes it worthwhile. You always want to go kill those bosses because in general they will drop you better gear than the most bosses will, especially right now Titan Forging and Warforging is removed. There is some really big value to getting these pieces, especially if you can, get a weapon plus 10 item levels and get a good crop on it. I think personally this is a great change by Blizzard. I really enjoy actually having some point to kill the last few bosses. It almost felt like, Sakul, why do we kill it? Oh, it drops you with Ezreal. And that is literally it. That's like the only real value Sakul has. And Azshara has, at least a cool trinket and really good weapon. But other than that, like for some special items, the bosses feel really unrewarding to kill because they're just way harder than the general loot piadas we have at the first few bosses. And it just kind of makes it feel like, do we want to clear these bosses even? It's just a lot of effort. So I do think these changes are really, really good. And personally, I am very, very glad that they put it in. Makes it more exciting to kill the bosses. As long as they can obviously balance gear. Right now there's some issues with, for example, the bosses dropping not every single type of weapon. So some classes are going to benefit more from it. And then some of the weapons are kind of wrong. As in, for example, it's an intellect sword, which only really mages, for example, can use. Hopefully they can change that, for example, to become a staff instead, so every single intellect user can run that weapon and not one intellect user so it's gonna be stronger because it has a plus 10 on a weapon. That's basically that for that topic. Going over to the Mythic Plus 15 changes. In these changes, what happened is that Mythic Plus now keeps scaling up higher than a 10. So whenever you complete a plus 15, it will give you 465 item level gear, I believe, which is 5 higher than Niflhotep heroic item level gear. So this basically means if you can farm plus 15s, you're going to be stronger than heroic raiders in terms of item level. And then the big change to it is if you complete a plus 15 as well, your weekly cash will become a mythic item level, which I think is 475? I could be wrong, I don't fully know the numbers. But yeah, you get somewhere around that item level, which is really, really good changes. Overall, I do like these changes, but they are kind of dangerous. So first off, what does this really mean for raiders? For raiders, this means during progress, if you are sitting out on a boss because your class isn't good there, for example, I set out on Ashvane, even though we ended up using me on Azshara, I set Ashvane because my class wasn't good for that boss and the boss wasn't complete free loot. So, I would sit for that boss because my class isn't good there, and I would come in on the bosses after again. This means that in times like that, I would be able to farm Mythic Plus actively and get really good gear. So I could farm Mythic Plus for a good weapon that can proc Corrupted. I could farm it for some high item level trinkets that could be really powerful. Or even just like, if you have like a ring with socket, or even if you just have like some haste first legs, on World First Progress, getting 5 item levels on things like legs, super big because it gives a lot of free stamina as well. So this does mean that World First raiding is going to be a lot active. It does promote having higher roster values, right? If you have more people can farm. That means that people that sit more bosses will actually get decked out with a lot of gear. Overall though, I do think this is really good changes. I've been saying it for a long time that I think plus 10 is too low to reward mythic item level loot. So I'm glad that they actually took it up to the plus 15s. This is really gonna promote people to, get away from the 10s and try and push a little bit further into higher M+. I think overall it's a good promotion for the game. I don't think I would change a lot from this. The only thing that I would say, and this has been a little bit of a discussion lately on Twitter and stuff as well, where this goes together with the plus 10 item level from the last few bosses, where again a lot of Mythic Plus players are unhappy because they cannot achieve the maximum amount of gear. They would have to raid again for the maximum amount of gear. Now, there is some truth in, M plus players have to do raids, raiders have to do M plus. Personally, my opinion on this is, after World First is done, if you complete a plus 20, you get max item level gear. So if you do a plus 20, you're gonna get the amount of item level that Carapace of N'Zoth and N'Zoth would drop. You could even make the plus 20 generalized item level drop mythic gear. The only thing that I'm scared about if they start promoting the plus 20 key farm for the really high item level stuff is that it's gonna impact possibly World First raiding too much. So I am up for a lot of solutions, but I would hope that it doesn't impact World First raiding more than the current plus 15 item levels. Anyway, that's my point of view as a raider. I know that this is a very heated topic, and I would like to hear your guys' choices inside the comments. Thank you very much, and this is my part.
Hi, I'm JB. I am the team captain and healer for Method NA, and I will be discussing today some of the changes we've seen on the PTR with regards to Mythic Plus loot and raiding loot, and how the two sort of affect each other and what we can expect going forward. So we'll start with the first of the two changes we've seen on the PTR, which is that Mythic Plus now awards the same eye level from the weekly cache as you get from base Mythic raid loot. And this is a very encouraging change that Blizzard made because previously in BFA, up until 8.3, the weekly cache gave out loot that was 5 eye levels lower than what you could get from base Mythic raid loot. And the justification Blizzard gave for this was that raiders needed to have additional encouragement to participate in raids because of the extra time and effort that it took to set up a raid group, the additional people that you needed, having 20 people as opposed to 5. And I think Blizzard just kind of figured that there needed to be a better reward coming from raids to encourage people to continue raiding because of sort of how much of a headache it was to actually put a raid group together. So Blizzard had been on the record as saying that they intentionally left the 5 eye level discrepancy between raid and Mythic Plus cache loot, and that especially in light of the fact that throughout the entirety of Legion, the Mythic Plus cache was the same eye level as raiding. That was kind of bad news for the Mythic Plus community and indicated that Blizzard maybe didn't take Mythic Plus as seriously as we would have liked them to. So the fact that they upped the eye level of the weekly cache to match base Mythic raid loot was really good news, both for this patch and for the future, and kind of demonstrated that Blizzard maybe thinks now that Mythic Plus kind of deserves the same seat at the table as raiding. And so I was very excited to hear that change. Now, along with that change was the fact that it used to be that you could get max eye level out of your Mythic cache for doing a 10 key, and Blizzard has now upped that requirement to a 15 key. Now, that will be a significant bump and challenge for the people that are trying to get their weekly cache done. I think for those of us that run keys on a regular basis, that consider that a core part of our gameplay, that change is probably not going to be a big deal. And I think a lot of people are actually sort of excited because it might get people running higher keys in general. But for those people that have been doing Mythic Plus just to get done with their weekly cache, they just walked in with an alt or something, knocked out the one dungeon, and then stopped doing keys, it's maybe going to be frustrating because each level bump on a key increases the health and damage of a mob by 10%. So by going from a 10 to a 15, you're increasing the difficulty of the key by over 50% in terms of how much damage you have to do and how much damage you're going to take. And on top of that, the base level of Mythic 0 is increasing by 45% in 8.3. So when you combine sort of those two jumps, both from 10 to 15 and just the base Mythic 0 being increased by 45%, the challenge of a 15 key is going to be fairly dramatic, especially right when 8.3 launches. Until people start getting their eye level up higher, it will definitely be a challenge to finish at 15, and I expect that those people who had gotten used to being able to taking their sort of under-geared alts in and getting a 10 key done, being able to pug it relatively effortlessly, are going to be in for sort of a rough surprise. And I expect, especially early on in the patch, that there are going to be some people that are disgruntled with that change. So there are probably two different camps two different schools of thought on that change from the 10 to the 15 key. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a good or a bad change. It's just if you're a person who does Mythic Plus in sort of your everyday life, I think it'll be a change that's encouraging and that you're excited about. If you're a person that just slammed one dungeon a week to get the weekly cash, you will probably not be super happy with the change, as I imagine it'll make your life more difficult when it comes time to get that key done. As far as how I would have handled the change, I mean, I think the change from a 10 to a 15 requirement was expected and in some ways necessary, because one of the things that especially the raiding community I think has always been kind of upset about is the fact that they felt that what was necessary to get raid loot, the amount of effort required to get raid loot, was disproportionate to the amount of effort required to get your weekly cash done, especially in terms of time spent. You could a lot of times bang out a 10 key in like 15-20 minutes, whereas in order to get raid loot you would have to spend hours and hours, if not nights and nights, in a raid. Even once it's on farm, that raids would take a while to re-clear each time. And so the amount of time spent to get raid loot versus the weekly cash, there was a lot more time spent on raiding. So in order to even convince people that Mythic Plus sort of deserved more loot, there was always, I think, going to have to be a jump from the 10 difficulty. That was a necessary part of sort of growing Mythic Plus loot, moving the ball forward on that particular topic. So I think I was kind of surprised actually that hadn't happened sooner in the expansion, that something higher than a 10 was necessary. But definitely a change that I think people foresaw coming and was welcomed by the Mythic Plus community. And so, like I said, for people that are just using Mythic Plus to do alts and get their weekly done, probably not going to be super jazzed about it. I think the rest of us are excited and happy. And that kind of leads into the next change on the PTR, which is that after announcing that the weekly Mythic Plus cash will be the same eye level as base Mythic raid loot, Blizzard then kind of pulled the old switcheroo and said, oh, by the way, the last two bosses of Ny'alotha, which will be the raid in 8.3, last two bosses of Ny'alotha, Carapace and N'Zoth, are going to be dropping 485 loot. So now we've kind of shifted the definition of what exactly Mythic raid loot even is. The first 10 bosses will be 475, but the last two bosses will be 485. I think what that signals is, as much as I said that it was encouraging to see Blizzard increase the weekly Mythic Plus cash to 475 because it indicated that Blizzard thought maybe Mythic Plus was on par with raiding, the bump for the final two bosses to 485 loot indicates the exact opposite. And I think Blizzard has said pretty much, like they've sort of reaffirmed that by saying we need to give people more reason to raid, and we need to, we'll do that by increasing the loot that you get off the final two bosses and make those two bosses feel more meaningful. Now, I can sort of appreciate that sentiment of thinking that the final two bosses should give you something extra compared to the first few bosses, especially early in a raid. You could expect a lot of the bosses to be relatively easy. In fact, a lot of these bosses get pugged right out of the gate. That you form groups on the high pop servers that are capable of going in and clearing out, maybe the first, second, third boss within the first few weeks of a raid. So they aren't particularly difficult, but they've been, throughout BFA, the early bosses have been awarding the same eye-level loot as the last ones, and a lot of times, some of that loot off the first three bosses is actually just straight up better than the loot that you get off the final bosses. So I can appreciate Blizzard's desire to give players a reason to feel like the last few bosses are more meaningful, but making the loot off those last two bosses simply better than anything else you can get in the game feels pretty bad. Especially as somebody who does Mythic Plus as their primary game mode. And not just, Mythic Plus aren't the only people affected by this. If you're a PvPer, it's a similar deal. Where as a PvPer, it doesn't matter how good you are, you will never be able to get 485 loot from doing arenas or RBGs or anything like that. Even if you are like rank 1, even if you're operating near 3k rating as a PvPer, the only way you're going to get your hands on 485 loot with the removal of Warforging and Titan Forging is by going and doing raids. And I actually feel in some ways worse for PvPers because at least Mythic Plus and raiding are sort of two sides of the same PvE coin. But PvP is pretty much its own thing. And I think there's always been the expectation in the community that PvP and PvE would be separate but equal and have access to relatively the same eye-level loot. And so the fact that you've got these sort of three distinct end-game content formats with Mythic Plus, PvP, and raiding, but only raiding having access to 485 loot feels kind of disrespectful. It makes the rest of us feel like second-class citizens. And while I can appreciate Blizzard's desire to make the last two bosses seem more meaningful, giving them the best loot in the game bar none with no other way to get 485 loot feels like perhaps an overreaction from Blizzard. What I would like to see is an opportunity for PvPers and Mythic Plusers to have access to 485 loot. Now, you can put whatever kind of restriction on that you want. I'm not saying that it should be, that you should be able to do your weekly 15 and get 485 loot. I'm not saying that PvPers should be able to do, like win a game over 2100 and get access to 485. But I think those of us that consider ourselves at the top of the game for our respective in-game formats, either Arena or Mythic Plus, feel like there's definitely content available that's difficult enough to justify giving us 485 loot. For Mythic Plus, it might be that you would have to complete in time a level 20 key. For PvPers, it might be that you have to win X number of games over 2400 rating, which currently, 2400 rating is sort of the cutoff of what extra loot you get. Once you go above 2400, there's really no reason to continue pushing. As far as loot is concerned, if you added 485 into arenas, there would now be an additional thing that maybe PvPers at that rating, at that Gladiator rating, could now feel like, oh yeah, if I keep playing and performing, I can now get access to 485 loot. So mostly I think it's just frustrating that Blizzard has chosen rating in such an obvious and intentional way to stand out above everything else. And there's been always a tension there at the end game, in one side feeling favored perhaps over the other. And in this way, it feels like Blizzard has very directly said, like, yes, rating is the favored child, and we are going to reward it above all others, and that's the end of the story. So as someone who does Mythic Plus, obviously not a great move for me. I know there are a lot of people that participate in all forms of in-game content, and for a lot of them, they're excited about this. And if you raid at all, I'm sure you would be excited that the final two bosses are going to be awarding higher eye-level loot. But there's issues with this for a number of reasons beyond just the disparity between in-game contents. The first being that the loot off of the final two bosses is not usable by everybody. I know there's already been some outcry on the forums and like Twitter and whatnot that, for instance, a good example is casters. Right now, the only int weapon that drops off the final two bosses is a one-handed sword. And there's a lot of casters out there that cannot use a one-handed sword. Like all of the hybrid caster classes, the DPS hybrid casters cannot use a sword. So Shadow Priests, Boomkins, Shamans, unavailable. They have no 485 int weapon. I mean, that's a sizable chunk of most people's raid roster. I mean, that's going to affect quite a few people. This is not a small niche thing. There's a lot of people that don't have access to a weapon off the final two bosses. 10 eye levels is a big deal. That is almost the jump that you get from difficulty levels. That's 10 eye levels is essentially the same as going from heroic to mythic or normal to heroic. And so you're basically giving the players that have loot off those final two bosses an entire difficulty jump of eye level, and with no way to replace it. If you don't have an int weapon, if you can't use a sword, tough luck. That's just, you don't get it. There's also Azerite that comes off the final two bosses, two pieces, in fact. There is no other way to get 45 Azerite in the game. That will be the only source of 45 Azerite. And Azerite has always been the one thing in this expansion that no matter what else happens, Azerite was always the same eye level. No matter where you got it from, it was always capped out at the same level. It was impossible for Azerite to like Warforge or Titanforge. So you knew that if you had the max level of Azerite, it was going to be the same as anybody else's max level of Azerite. That is no longer true. And it's not even like we're just talking about one piece of Azerite. We're talking about two pieces. Two of the three pieces of Azerite you can get can now be potentially 485. So when you look at how much of your stats come from Azerite, the chunk of like stamina and primary stat that come from Azerite, as well as the traits that you can get and how much scaling you get on traits through 10 eye levels, this is a potentially like massive chunk of stats that could be changing by being able to go to 485 instead of 475. So I expect this disparity to end up being fairly significant. And even among the raiders who finish the last two bosses, if you don't have that loot available to you, if you're not one of the classes that has something that drops off those final two bosses, you'll also feel essentially left out. So I feel like this is doing a lot to sort of disenfranchise different players in the game and make them feel like second-class citizens, make them feel less important than their raiding counterparts. And I don't think it's a good look. I don't think it's helpful for the game. I think there's other ways that you could have rewarded players for finishing the raid other than giving them literally the best loot in the game. And I expect there to be more, not less, complaining and outcry about this as the patch gets closer. I hope Blizzard does something to rectify this, to change the eye level loot, to approach it in a different way than to simply give 10 eye levels to the raiders. I hope that I have represented the Mythic Plusers appropriately on this little monologue, and definitely let us know how you guys feel about it in the comments. If you think this was a good or bad move by Blizzard, I guess we'll find out in 8.3.